Most conquerors wanted your land. Some wanted your gold. But Genghis Khan wanted something far more valuable, your utility. In the year 1206, the great Khan stopped looking at humans as people and started looking at them as logistics. He didn't just build an empire. He built a machine that fueled itself using the bodies of the people it had just crushed. This wasn't just war. This was the most efficient system of human extraction ever devised. And for the people of the Khwarezmian Empire, the math of that system was about to become a death sentence. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. In the year 1206, a shadow fell across the world that was unlike any that had come before. It was not the shadow of a new god or a simple plague, but the shadow of a man who had mastered the ultimate logic of efficiency. Genghis Khan did not look at the horizon and see empires to be conquered. He saw a series of logistical problems that required human solutions. To any military commander before him, a prisoner of war was a liability, a mouth to feed, a body to guard, and a potential rebel to watch. But the great Khan saw something else entirely. He realized that a human being, stripped of their weapons and their dignity, was the most versatile form of ammunition ever devised. This was not the chaotic cruelty of a bandit. This was the birth of a system. Genghis Khan's armies did not simply take slaves, they deployed them. They integrated the conquered into their military machine before the blood on the battlefield was even dry. When the Mongol horsemen rode toward the proud cities of the Khwarezmian Empire, they were not just bringing bows and swords. They were bringing a psychological horror that defied the laws of traditional warfare. They were bringing the fathers, brothers, and sons of the very people they intended to destroy. The Persian historian Etymalik Juvayni, who lived within the Mongol administration and witnessed these events firsthand, recorded the truth of the 1219 campaign. He described a process that was as orderly as a tax harvest. When a city surrendered or fell, the Mongols did not engage in mindless slaughter. That would be a waste of resources. Instead, they performed a census of the survivors. They looked for the peaceful citizens, the merchants, the farmers, and the weavers who had surrendered because they were promised safety. These people were told their lives would be spared. It was a calculated lie, designed to keep them compliant until their utility was required. These captives were then driven at spearpoint toward the front of the Mongol siege lines. They were not given armor to protect their chests or helmets to shield their heads. Instead, they were given the tools of the laborer, timber, heavy stones, and bags of earth. Their job was to walk at the very leading edge of the Mongol advance. Imagine the perspective of a defender standing on the high walls of his city. You look down, and you see a massive army approaching. But at the front, you don't see the fur-clad Mongol warriors. You see the faces of your neighbors from the next town over. You see the merchant who sold you silk last month. You see men who speak your language, share your faith, and cry out to you for mercy. This was the Mongol dilemma. It was a weapon made of flesh and blood. If you fire your arrows, you kill your own countrymen. If you hold your fire out of compassion, the Mongol engineers move behind their living shield, closing the distance until the city walls are breached. Either way, the Mongols advance. Either way, the defenders lose. By the time the battle properly began, the defenders had already lost their ground or their souls. This was the cold arithmetic of the steppe, a system where every captive who died in the moat was a Mongol soldier who lived to fight another day. In the eyes of the Khan, the math was perfect, and the cost of human life was merely the price of progress. When the city of Bukhara fell in February 1220, the people inside believed the worst was over. They had heard the stories of Mongol cruelty, but they had surrendered. They hoped for the mercy that usually follows a white flag. But to Genghis Khan, surrender was not the end of the process. It was the beginning of a harvest. He did not see a city of people. He saw a warehouse of biological parts. The great Khan entered the city and, according to the records, he did something that chilled the survivors to the bone. He did not call for a celebration. He called for a census. This was the administrative horror of the Mongol Empire. They were masters of the Yossa, their code of laws, which treated conquest like a business transaction. The population of Bukhara was driven out into the open plains outside the city walls. Tens of thousands of civilians, mothers holding infants, old men leaning on sticks, merchants clutching their last coins, stood in the dust, waiting for a judgment they did not understand. Then, the sorting began. This is what the historians call the standard categories of the Yossa. It was as cold as a modern factory line. Mongol administrators moved through the crowds, separating people based on their utility. First, they looked for the craftsman. If you were a blacksmith, a weaver, a carpenter, or a mason, you were roped together. You were no longer a citizen of Bukhara. You were now state property. You were destined for a 3,000-kilometer march to the east to build the Khan's capital. Next, they looked for the soldiers. These men faced a darker fate. They were either executed on the spot, because a professional soldier is a threat, or they were conscripted into the lowest ranks of the Mongol auxiliaries, forced to fight their own kind. But it was the remainder, the civilians, who faced the most inventive cruelty. These were the men who had no special skills. To any other conqueror, they were useless. To Genghis Khan, they were the most important part of his next siege. These men were issued nothing. No weapons to defend themselves, no armor to stop a bolt, and no food beyond the bare minimum to keep them walking. They were organized into columns and told to start marching toward Samarkand, the next great jewel of the empire. The march itself was a filter. The Mongols did not care about the individual. If a man stumbled, he was killed. If a man slowed down, he was killed. The administrators actually began accounting for these deaths in their planning. They knew that a certain percentage of their human ammunition would break before reaching the target, so they simply gathered more than they needed. As the walls of Samarkand appeared on the horizon in March 1220, the captives realized why they had been kept alive. They weren't being taken to a new home. They were being positioned at the leading edge of a nightmare. They were the barrier that would protect the Mongol elite from the arrows of their own friends. By March 1220, the Mongol war machine arrived at the gates of Samarkand. Samarkand was one of the greatest cities in the world, a hub of the Silk Road filled with scholars, massive blue-domed mosques, and high, thick walls. The defenders inside believed they were prepared. They had stored grain, they had deep wells, and they had thousands of brave soldiers ready to rain arrows down on any Mongol who stepped within range. But when the sun rose on the first day of the siege, the defenders did not see the terrifying Mongol cavalry. Instead, they saw a massive, slow-moving cloud of dust. As the cloud cleared, the soldiers on the walls lowered their bows in confusion and horror. Walking toward them was a vast sea of people, thousands of them, carrying bundles of sticks, bags of earth, and heavy timber. These were the people of Bukhara. The defenders recognized them. They saw the faces of merchants they had traded with just weeks before. They saw the farmers who supplied their markets. This was the living barrier in its most literal form. The Mongol commanders stayed far back, shielded by this wall of human flesh. The orders given to the captives were simple: fill the deep moats that surrounded Samarkand. To the Mongols, a moat was just a mathematical problem. It required a certain volume of earth to fill so that the heavy siege towers could roll across. They didn't care if that earth was mixed with the bodies of the people carrying it. Under the threat of Mongol spears at their backs, the captives from Bukhara were forced to march into the killing zone of their own friends' arrows. The dilemma for the garrison of Samarkand was agonizing. If they fired, they were murdering the very people they were supposed to protect. If they didn't fire, the Mongols would cross the moat and slaughter everyone inside. The air was filled with the screams of captives pleading for their lives and the sound of arrows hitting wood and bone. Giovanni records that the captives were used to take the brunt of the boiling oil and the Greek fire poured from the battlements. They were the biological sponges meant to soak up the city's defenses. The arithmetic of Genghis Khan worked perfectly. For 5 days, the defenders' morale crumbled as they were forced to watch their neighbors die by their own hands. On the 5th day, the garrison surrendered. They thought that by giving up, they could save the remaining captives. They were wrong. The survivors of the living wall were not set free. The Mongols simply gathered them up, evaluated who was still strong enough to walk, and added them to the next column. They were no longer humans. They were a reusable resource. The survivors of Samarkand would now become the ammunition for the next city on the list. While the human ammunition was being spent at the walls of Samarkand, a different, more quiet horror was unfolding behind the Mongol lines. Genghis Khan was not just a destroyer, he was a harvester. He understood a fundamental truth of power. Gold can be stolen and grain can be eaten, but a skilled mind is a factory that produces wealth and victory forever. To the Mongols, a captured doctor was more valuable than a chest of jewels. A siege engineer was worth more than 100 soldiers. Before the general slaughter began in any city, and before the living barriers were marched away, the Mongol administrators moved through the terrified crowds. They did not carry swords, they carried ledgers. They asked specific, pointed questions that sounded almost like a modern job interview. Who among you is a blacksmith? Who is a weaver? Who can calculate? Who knows the secrets of medicine? If you raised your hand, you were not saved, you were claimed. You became the personal property of the Khan. These craftsmen were roped together in long, miserable lines. Their destination was Karakoram, the Mongol capital, thousands of kilometers away across the most brutal terrain on the planet. They were forced to march through the burning sands of the Kyzylkum Desert and over the frozen, oxygen-thin passes of the Pamir Mountains. The records of Giovanni and other chroniclers paint a grim picture of these talent marches. The Mongols treated these human assets like livestock. They provided minimal rations, just enough to keep a man walking, but never enough to make him strong. If a master weaver fell behind because of exhaustion, he was killed on the spot. The logic was simple: if the Khan could not have him, no one could. The death rate was so high and so consistent that the Mongol accountants began to overorder. If the Khan needed 500 engineers for a project in the east, the administrators would seize 800, knowing that 300 would die in the dirt before they ever saw the capital. For the women of the conquered cities, the sorting was equally clinical and equally heartless. Those with skills like midwifery or high-level literacy were flagged for productive labor. The rest were assigned to personal service. In the administrative texts of the time, this was a polite phrase for a dark reality. They were distributed among the generals and the Khan's household as rewards for loyalty. To Genghis Khan, the acquisition of a defeated king's daughter was not just about desire, it was political theater. By holding the royal women of a fallen empire in his tents, he was making a statement in flesh. He was showing the world that the former kings were not just dead, they were erased. Their legacy was now literally serving the Mongol table. There was no room for refusal. In the Mongol system, a disobedient slave was simply a broken tool, and broken tools were discarded without a second thought. The most haunting part of the Nishapur massacre was not the soldiers who did the killing, but the hands that built the pyramids. As the piles of heads rose toward the sky, the Mongol soldiers eventually grew tired of the labor. To finish the monuments, they brought forward the human ammunition from previous cities, the men who had filled the moats at Samarkand and survived the marches across the desert. These captives were forced to stack the severed heads of the people of Nishapur before being executed themselves. The system was so efficient that it used its last remaining resources to clean up its own crime. By the time the historian Giovanni recorded these events, he did so with a strange, detached tone. He did not write with the emotional fury of a victim. He wrote with the clinical precision of a man who had become part of the machine. Giovanni eventually served as an administrator for the Mongols. He had learned the ultimate lesson of the 13th century. In the world Genghis Khan created, there were only two types of people, those who were used and those who did the using. This was the true legacy of the Mongol slave system. It wasn't just about the blood or the fire. It was about the total erasure of the individual. Under the Mongol administration, a person was stripped of their name, their family, and their humanity. They were reduced to a line item in a ledger. A weaver was a tool for the capital. A farmer was a shield for the front lines. A daughter was a political trophy. Even the dead were just building materials for a pyramid of heads. Genghis Khan had proved that a military could be more than an army. It could be a massive, self-sustaining organism that consumed everything in its path. By sparing the Mongol soldier and spending the captive, he created a cycle of conquest that seemed impossible to stop. The wealth of the world flowed east, while the people of the world were ground into the dust of the Silk Road. Today, the cities of the Khwarezmian Empire have long been rebuilt, and the sands have buried the pyramids of Nishapur. But the lesson remains. The Mongol conquest showed that the most terrifying thing a government can do is not to hate its enemies, but to view them with absolute, cold indifference, to see human beings as nothing more than arithmetic. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer the world, he calculated it, and in that calculation, the value of a human life was always zero. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.